Thank you so much for this introduction, and maybe you can please help me. Good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you, and maybe I need the keyboard. All those credentials aside, I'm probably one of the least qualified people here to speak in any kind of academic sense on this issue. But when I first met with Petra, we talked about the possibility of coming here. And a couple of years later, I found myself traveling to Israel to see friends, and this wonderful opportunity emerged. The suggested talk about the persecution of Christians in the Muslim world, particularly in the Middle East, was something that I'm very interested in because I follow the persecution of Muslim minorities in the Muslim world. And so my own reading has been broadened because of this opportunity, for which I'm very grateful. I think what I would like to do, if we can lower the lights, is begin with a video, if it works, and I would like you to listen to it very carefully. It's very brief. And if whoever is sitting at the front can also see, and we will see if it works.
So what
Minister Bhatti, we forgot one question in the interview. Your life is threatened. By whom? And what sort of threats are you receiving?
The forces of violence, militant band organization, the Taliban and pro-Al-Qaeda, they want to impose their radical philosophy in Pakistan. And whoever stand against their radical philosophy, they threaten them. When I'm leading this campaign against the Sharia laws, for the abolishment of blasphemy law, and speaking for the oppressed and marginalized, persecuted Christian and other minorities, these Taliban threaten me. But I want to share that I believe in Jesus Christ, who has given his own life for us. I know what is the meaning of cross, and I'm following of the cross. And I'm ready to die for a cause. I'm living for my community and suffering people, and I will die to defend their rights. So these threats and these warnings cannot change my opinion and principles. I will prefer to die for my principle and for the justice of my community, rather to compromise against on these threats.
Thank you.
So we're going to maybe we can find my presentation, Ariel, on the screen. I wonder if anybody can tell me who that was speaking. You may well recognize him. Does anybody know his name? It's a very important gentleman who was called Shabazz Bhatti. He was the only Christian minister in the Pakistani parliament. And you see a video that he recorded with a journalist in Pakistan, a Geo News channel, talking about the death threats that he was facing. I want you to understand that that's one aspect of persecution. Mr. Bhatti was assassinated shortly after that video. And this, I'm going to speak, even though the directive was to speak about the Middle East, and Pakistan is not officially in the Middle East, Pakistan is an epicenter of persecution of minorities and Christians in particular that I really want you to understand, because it has a relevance here in the Middle East. And we're going to come back to Mr. Bhatti's story, and also similar individuals who died for their beliefs. And I just wanted you to see him in his own words. This is, as I don't need to tell anybody here, this is far from an academic or intellectual exercise. This is a real conflict, and a conflict that is not given adequate publicity, awareness, knowledge, scholarship, columns in the print. If you can see this image, this is from a very recently published Pew report, which is one of the sources that I rely on heavily when I'm preparing articles. It is a map of the world's Muslim distribution, and you can change the lights if audiences can't see it. But in this, you will find, let's see, we can locate ourselves here, Israel. It's a weighted map, so each square is a relevant amount for the population. I want you to look, we find Saudi Arabia, where I've lived, which is a a very powerful force in modern Islam because it is the custodian of the holy cities. It is also the driving force for Sunni Islam, Sunni policy making, and of course the center and epicenter for the fueling of a global ideology of Wahhabism. We hear a lot about Iran at the moment, which, as you know, is Shia dominant. But I want you to look at this behemoth here, Pakistan. By the end of this decade, in 2020, about the time that the FIFA World Cup for soccer comes to Qatar, which is the first time that competition has come to the Muslim world, Pakistan will be the most populous Muslim country in the world, exceeding Indonesia. So to me, what happens in Pakistan is very important for what is going to happen globally. Pakistan has additional influences that also add to the contraction of religious freedoms that we're going to talk about in due course. So let's get into this. Oops. I see, I'm going the wrong way. This vehicle is what happened to Shabazz Bhatti. He was waiting in Pakistan outside the home of his mother and was ambushed and assassinated by radicals. He was assassinated not just because he was Christian, but he was the chairman and minister of all of the affairs pertaining to minorities in Pakistan. This happened on March 2011. He was particularly targeted because he was a vociferous critic of the blasphemy laws about which we are going to discuss. So defending the rights of minorities or criticizing the impact of the blasphemy laws is a life and death business in what is known as the world's first Muslim democracy. And I say that with a great deal of, when I use the word democracy, I don't believe Pakistan represents a democracy, but this is how it's labeled. And in my reading, I discovered, also from some very recent sources, there's an important report that has just come out by the Pew Templeton Foundation about the rising persecutions based on religion in the world. 75% of all persecution of any nature is conducted on Christians and directed at Christians. This was something new to me. The majority is by a staggering amount. These are the number of countries that are involved. This is all public data. You're easily able to access it, or if you wish to take images, it's not copyrighted. It's here to be shared. The sources are available. Over 130 countries see some form of persecution happening to Christians. A big message in this is where you see persecutions happening to Christians, you will see persecutions happening to many other religions. They go hand in hand. You will see somewhat far behind, 117 countries are involved in the persecution of Muslims, and close to them, Jewish individuals are persecuted in over 75 countries. This may be a reflection of the relative population. This is a very high number of countries impacting Jewish individuals, and the global Jewish population is relatively small. But the dominance of Christians as victims of persecution is unquestionable in many different scales. Where are they persecuted? A lot of the persecution happens in this region, though not only. And we see that there have been some changes in patterns, depending on what scales are used to measure it. Scales at the moment are classified, to my limited understanding, in whether a government imposes restrictions on an individual's religious freedom, or whether there are individual mob or vigilante or community attacks on individuals, which are called social restrictions. Both scales you see, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and to my knowledge Uzbekistan, predominantly Muslim societies, and Egypt, of course, has moved up the scale. I'm surprised not to see Pakistan in the top 10 in either list, and that would really be something I would like to talk to the authors about, why it didn't make that list. I would also point out, look at Indonesia and Malaysia, very typically categorized as moderate Muslim countries, countries that are succeeding, particularly Indonesia as a democracy, has very high scores on these scales of restricting religious freedom and restricting the expression of a religious identity. Oops, going the wrong way. Why do people persecute others of a certain belief, a religious belief? It's usually for several motives, and all this data is taken from an outstanding book which I have with me called Persecuted, which I recommend everybody to read. It was published recently, written by Paul Marshall and Nina Shea and Layla Gilbert, and it's very important reading. The motives are very simple. Absolute political control is one motive. An example, let's say communism or any kind of totalitarian ideology. My feeling about political Islamism is that's what motivates political Islamists to extinguish any other religious observation or affiliation or identity, because another identity is a threat and threatens a power base. Though obviously it can be, there can be much more mendacious motives than merely political control. People have been shocked at the fate of the Rohingyas, who you know about in Myanmar, particularly as Aung San Suu Kyi has been recently released and now is a free figure. There it is about preservation of a particular culture that is also exercising a particular kind of supremacy. And then we come to the Muslim world, which has several unique motives in conducting religious persecution. And we are going to focus on two countries in particular in which I've been directly involved. One is Saudi Arabia, where I've lived and I've also traveled and frequently consulted there, and another will be Pakistan. The motives are really about Islamist dominance. These words are not very useful. Even radical is not very useful as a word, because when we think about radical, we sometimes associate it with violence, for instance, as you saw in the very opening segment. But radical, I think, also refers to really aggressive ideologies which are purely totalitarian and very dangerous. They're highly politicized. They're more politicized and made more dangerous because they're religionized. That's what I mean by radical, but you can be a radical Islamist and you can be violent, or you can be a radical Islamist and you can be non-violent. Differentiating the two is important because many non-Islamists feel that if there's no violence, they may be relatively safe. Let's an example being the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. They got into power by democratic means, and they are certainly disengaged from violence as far as they officially appear to be, but they are no less malignant than somebody that you would associate with a radical violent movement involving jihadist ideology. I know you asked me to talk about a solution, but before we can talk about a solution, we really have to get to grips with the problem. Other areas that I'm not informed about, which can seed religious persecution, post-war, let's say the post-war vacuum in Iraq is a great example, which I know that Reverend Held will know about. But I'm also expecting that there will be rising persecution of minorities as the United States departs from Afghanistan. We're already seeing that in the northwestern border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, where minorities like the Hazaras are being persecuted for ethnic reasons. So let's look at Saudi Arabia before we go any further. What can I tell you about persecution in Saudi Arabia? I moved there in 1999, now almost 15 years ago. Before I went there, I was hired, like most Western workers, by a recruiting agency where it was made clear to me that I was subscribing to all of the laws of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia governs by what it terms to be Sharia, or Islamic law. There is no written law. It is all oral. It is in the hands of lawmakers empowered by the state. There's no document or constitution that you can really refer to. There is what is called a shura, which is a council, which until recently was only populated by men. And in the last few months, a female shura has come into power. They have no elected or public power. They work at the pleasure of those who appoint them, which are the monarchists. You see, this image is one taken very recently, about last year, of Mecca, the Kaaba, which you know predates Islam by many millennia. We feel this is the spot where Abraham consecrated the Kaaba and told people that there is one God and we believe in one God. And this is a scene from Hajj, from the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca. It wasn't until in the first few months of my stay in Saudi Arabia that I actually encountered any kind of pluralism in terms of Islam by going to Hajj. So that means that while I was living in Saudi Arabia proper, or whenever I travel to Saudi Arabia, the air that you breathe and the ether that you move in is one brand of official Islam. That means, and that saw me as a particular entity, as a female, and it's something that I've written and published about, and I believe is an expression of gender apartheid. I find it fundamentally un-Islamic, but women are legally made to be minors indefinitely. So what does that mean to me as a foreign worker? I went there unmarried as a British citizen. As soon as you enter the country, your passport is taken from you by passport control, and it is given to a sponsor who represents your employer. I do not have my passport in my possession for the time that I live in Riyadh. If I need to travel back to New York, I go to my employer and I ask for an exit visa, and if it's granted, I get my passport back and leave. That's how a foreigner lives there. I at least have a passport. Many women who are living there will not have their own individual documentation. Their documentation will be tied to men. Until very recently, female births were not registered, and that's within the last decade. So we actually don't have a good idea of the census of Saudi Arabia. How else can I tell you you would perceive religion? If you imagine I'm in the healthcare field, most of the nurses in the Middle East in that area were coming from the Philippines, Kerala state in India, a few British, a few Canadian, not many Americans at that time because the economic opportunity was better in Britain. There are very strict instructions not to bring any symbol of a religion into the country other than Islam. These laws are so strict that my own parents, who are Muslim, reminded me before I left not to take a copy of my Quran with me, simply because it was published in London and with translation, and they weren't sure if it would be palatable to Saudis if they should look at the Quran that I was bringing. So I left my Quran in New York. I don't know if any of you have lived in areas where religion is repressed to this degree. But when you are, let's say, 31, which is what I was when I moved there, and somebody tells you that it's unlawful to display any symbol of a religion. I can see several religious symbols as I'm standing here. When I'm seeing my patients, I see my Filipino nurse, and she has a cross that's emerging from the T-shirt, and I asked her to cover it up. I didn't ask her to cover it up because it offended me. I was afraid for her. Another example, it's December. This was the first time that I'd worked in a hospital where there were no Christmas decorations. If you've been a doctor on call most of your life, one of the things that's nice about the wintertime is the Christmas decorations. In New York, they're often a place for a menorah or Hanukkah symbols. So this was a very stark environment to be in, where there was no religious symbols on Christmas Day. One of my nurses, however, was busy ordering presents for her family, and there was a catalog of Christmas items from an overseas shop. I asked her to put it away. This is not because these were my beliefs. This is the intimidation. So while you hear in the world about the persecution in terms of physical violence or extinction or assassination the way I'm describing, in reality it's actually a silence and a hiding. It's a hiding that the individual who has the different beliefs has to undertake, and it's a hiding and silencing that those who don't even share that politics or belief, who value other prophets, who value other books, also participate in. And that's probably something I've only just realized in recent months thinking about this issue, is that I didn't even question whether this was right or wrong. You intrinsically knew you didn't speak about it. Another example to give you, one of my close friends there was the chairman of the emergency room, who's a Canadian, who is a devoted Christian, and whenever they had vacation, he and his wife would go and do projects in India, Pondicherry, Africa, usually charitable or health missions. And one day we were speaking on the phone, and I said, why don't I come over on, I guess it would have been Friday morning. He said, I will be at the embassy at the services. So on the phone, I said, well, I'll come over when you've come back from church, forgetting that we don't speak about these things in Saudi Arabia, and I covered my own mouth on the telephone out of fear. Nobody heard anything. And Ken was a Canadian who would worship at the Canadian embassy, like most of the Christians who are in Saudi Arabia who are expats still do now. There are Saudi Christians that you can read about in the persecuted book who go about their lives with great difficulty. My friend even told me how he built a nativity scene in his villa in the Saudi compound where he was employed, and nobody asked him any questions when he was building a manger and he was preparing a scene in his own home. He was doing that at great risk. So religious persecution in areas where you are a member of the dominant religion is something that is very subtle. It does not involve bloodshed, but it engages anyone who is there. The Christians themselves are very quiet. I had a friend, my first friend there was an Ethiopian pharmacist, and he was African color, African hair, and very friendly, and also trained from the United States. So we immediately became friends and went to go to lunch, and I never questioned that he was not observing Ramadan. I was raised in my family that Ramadan, which is the Muslim month of fasting, is something you should do, but if you're not healthy or you don't feel strong, it's certainly not supposed to be an ordeal for a busy female doctor. My parents always said, your work is your worship. So I had no intentions of observing Ramadan when I arrived to Saudi Arabia. This was a real aberration. But I would go to have my lunch with my colleague, who I assumed, because he had dark skin and because he was Ethiopian in origin, maybe also a Muslim. It was about 2 months before I realized he was a Coptic Christian when he told me. That's how powerful religious repression is. I don't need to tell you the consequences of observing another religion in Saudi Arabia. There is no public institute of any kind that you can see in the country. After a few months, After a few months of living there, I was invited to an American base for breakfast where expats would go. So the weekend in Saudi Arabia is Thursday and Friday. So on Friday we went for our breakfast, and we finished and we're taking a stroll. And on the United States base they have a few little shops. And as we walk by, I look into an open doorway. I'm with my Christian, Canadian and American friends. And I see a circle of men and women, and they're sitting on chairs rather like yours. The room is completely empty. There is nothing on the walls. There's no table. There's no focal point for the room. And I paused. It was about maybe 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And the first thought that came to my mind was that they are engaged in a seance, which I've never seen a seance. I've only seen it in the movies. And I said, what are they doing? Because nobody was talking, their heads were down. And my friend said, they are Christians, they're praying. To me, this was extraordinary because I have had a Christian education in a Church of England school until I was 17 and learnt Christianity in parallel to Islam and know the Lord's Prayer and Easter and all this. But I was unable to recognize Christians, having been immersed in Christian society myself. That's within a few months. This is to show you really what you know. Saudi Arabia is a country for men. Male supremacy is legislated. Male supremacy has validity in testimony. It has validity in ownership. I was asking here, my tour guide in Jerusalem was an Israeli Arab who was born in Jerusalem. And I asked him if he wants to open a business in Jerusalem, do you have to have an Israeli partner? A Jewish Israeli partner. He found this anathema. He said, no, there is no law here requiring the Israeli Jewish partner. In Saudi Arabia, it's a rentier economy. There has to be a Saudi majority partner, whatever your business. If you're a Saudi woman, many of my friends are Saudi women business owners, they must have a male guardian that is registered on the business, even if it's all her creativity. Now, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction. Is that? Yeah. So in terms of women, what happened to me in this environment, my dress was immediately legislated. As soon as I leave the aircraft, I'm in a line. So when I left the aircraft here in Tel Aviv, a man was waiting for me for my convenience to show me where to go. When I leave the aircraft in Riyadh, I immediately know that I need to go to the women's line. even though most of the women arriving in the kingdom are not professionals. They were maids, they were a hired help, and most of the professionals were men, were going in a different line. But I understood that I'm supposed to be in the female line. This is a manufactured, and this is a very modern manifestation of Islam. This is what I call Wahhabism, but if you speak to any Saudi or any Arab, they protest at Wahhabism because this is a Western term that was actually formulated by British journalists in the 19th century when they were beginning to learn about Wahhabism. Saudi Arabia, there are also many good things about Saudi Arabia that I have personally written and experienced about, and chiefly they revolve around what they have done for healthcare in their society and also what they do globally, which they do out of their sense of Muslim duty of zakat, which means giving charity, which has been a lot of the origin of healthcare in the history of Islam, and we can talk about that. So certainly nothing is black and white. But Saudi Arabia is portrayed as a villain in the world of religious freedom and religious persecution. I think that villainy needs to be shared and perhaps is even overshadowed by Pakistan, something that is mentioned in both books by Paul Marshall and Nina Shea and Layla Gilbert, but not, in my opinion, sufficiently. Why is Pakistan more of a problem, even though you are not immediately related to Pakistan geographically? Well, I've just shown you that it is one of the largest Muslim countries in the world, with a population of approximately 187 million now, poised to go over the 200 million barrier in the end of the decade. What Pakistan has done is it has constitutionalized religious persecution. What does that mean? That means that in its documents which state what Pakistan represents and what is available to the citizen, there is a mechanism for persecuting minorities. What is a minority? A minority is anyone who does not fit in the official state version of Islam, which includes most likely everybody in this room and many Christians. About 3 to 5% of Pakistan's population is estimated to be Christian, many millions of individuals. If you think about Pakistan, I don't know what that music is. I can hear something. Okay, somebody calling in to raise an objection to me, no doubt. So this is an image of Pakistan that you may not be familiar with, where unless somebody has traveled there and is from there, one of my favorite haunts. I like to watch the polo matches. And if you look at this scene, this could be Windsor in England. In Pakistan, there are really several worlds. We think of it as a democracy because they have a parliament, they have the organs of democracy which are there from the vestiges of when Britain had an empire. There is a Supreme Court, there is a federal government, there are provinces that are federally mandated, there are individuals who can run for election, and there is a very affluent elite group among whom are people that patronize this place. You would be surprised to find that when you go to a place like the Lahore Polo Club, women are wearing Tory birch, women are wearing Gucci, the men are very dashingly dressed, and it is a very mixed crowd, rather like we are. Women are not veiled, they have their hair dyed. It's a liberal place. On my recent visit to Pakistan, this time last year, I was surprised to see a rise in the number of veiled women, extremely veiled, which I call a symbol of neo-orthodoxy. Both women are wearing what are called niqabs, where the face is veiled, the head is veiled. This is in Pakistan, this is not in Saudi Arabia. Even in Saudi Arabia now, when you go, and when I go, I have a much more decorated external gown, which is often open in the front and my hair may be uncovered. This is an importation of extremist ideology. In Pakistan, in this crowd, this was in the Lahore Polo Club, which I just showed you, looks like Windsor or looks like Bridgehampton, if you know that part of the world. You begin to see in the audience women who have completely facially veiled. These are not maids. These are not women who have come in to look after the children. These are part of the elite Pakistani moneyed crowd. You have to be well off to come and even watch polo. It's not open for the hoi polloi. And this was a novelty to me. This is a very rapid change. While one of the most famous incidents, which comes back to our initial observation about Shabazz Bhatti, is about this family. These 3 daughters are holding a photograph of their mother, whose name you will recognize as Asia Bibi. Asia Bibi is a Christian woman from a very poor setting who is currently imprisoned under charge of blasphemy. She's a very important woman, and there have been many people who've written about her, and these are her forlorn children holding their mother's photograph, missing her. This woman, you won't know by recognition, but you will have heard of her. Asia Bibi's case was probably, I think, 5 years ago now already. This woman is called Rimsha Masih, who made world headlines when she was accused of blasphemy, and she has a developmental delay. I'm not sure. The press has reported her to have Down syndrome, but I don't know if that's accurate. She was a minor, probably 14 or 15 years old, and she was in prison for blasphemy on false testimony. Somebody accused her of burning the page of the Quran. According to which versions according to whichever versions you listen to, it may even have been a brother in her family who accused her of the false testimony, or it was the local imam. This scene is more recent. And I don't know if you recognize this image. It's from a place called Joseph Colony, which you have perhaps heard about in Pakistan, which is a place where Christians tend to live, a Christian district. And a man there had a disagreement with a long-standing Muslim friend of his. Some reports have reported them as playing cards or drinking together or having some sort of relationship. And the Muslim reported his friend having blasphemed. And we're going to get into what they mean by blasphemy. A group of hoodlums came back to search for this individual, tracked down the father, and violently handled the father. Did not find the offending individual. And the next day, a mob of several hundred individuals came back and razed to the ground over 178 homes. This is not in a remote part of Pakistan. Pakistan is a city of about, Karachi is a city of about 18 million. And this was in broad daylight. No fire engines were sent in to the end of the day. The Pakistani police was there, Pakistani security forces, but they did not intervene. That's how religious persecution happens. It happens because a tyrannical majority, feels empowered. Now, let me see, did I miss one? This is an incredible tragedy to me, because my parents are of Pakistani heritage. They're Pakistani not by birth, because they are in their mid-70s. They're originally born in India, but because they were Muslim, they moved to Pakistan. And Pakistan was founded by a man who is commemorated in this mausoleum, Muhammad A. Jinnah. Now, I believe Jinnah was a secular and staunch Democrat. He had an idea that the Muslims needed a democratic state with political influence to protect what was a religious minority in what was going to be India proper. India proper was much more predominantly Hindu than it was Muslim, and in the lead up to the division of India and Pakistan, there'd been rising extremist persecution on both sides. So he conceived of a democracy that would be a country where Muslims would be safe. This country was formed a year before the country in which we speak. 1947 was the formation of Pakistan, 1948 the birth of Israel, I think. India was 47, it's the next day. But Israel was the next year. You would think that on principle for a similar reason, though under very different circumstances. To underline Jinnah's ideals, there was a very famous speech, and don't worry about reading it, I'll tell you the story. 3 days before Pakistan was founded. So on the 11th of August 1947, Jinnah spoke to his politicians, and he gave a speech which was given at the Constitutional Club, or the Karachi Club. And it explained how it was going to be beyond the provenance of the state to be interfering in an individual's religious belief. He didn't see that had any place in state government. It would be a place where individuals are free to go to your temples, these are his words, free to go to your mosques, free to go to any other place of worship in the state of Pakistan. At the time of Pakistan's formation, there was a sizable Jewish population, particularly in Karachi, which is now all but extinct. you may belong to any religion or caste, referring of course to Hindus, or creed, which was his ideal. That ideal is as much a mausoleum as the one I've just shown you. And I will give you the reasons for why it is a mausoleum, but my other colleagues will be speaking, and I'm going to talk to you about that in detail. When I recently went to Pakistan, I went for two special reasons. I went to see my family, but I also went to see some child soldiers that had worked with the Taliban in the northwest frontier. Little boys from 11 to 20 who'd been motivated to become jihadists, partly, I think, because of the sectarianism intrinsic to Pakistan. I was very interested to know what it's like to be a minority in Pakistan. I tried hard to locate the remnants of the Jewish community in Karachi, but I was not able to build enough trust with strangers that could have connected me in the short time that I was there. It is said that the Jewish community in Pakistan may comprise less than 400 individuals and is by and large discreetly living amongst the Zoroastrians in Pakistan. The Zoroastrians are very private and guard their autonomy, with very carefully. So I did meet Zoroastrians, but nobody was willing to introduce me to any Jewish residents of Karachi, which was fine. I was introduced to this young lady whose name I won't say, who was a medical student in my cousin's medical school, and she is a Christian lady. And I asked her, what is it like to be a Christian in Pakistan? And she explained how she was afraid ever to participate in any discussion involving religion of any kind, even if people said grossly erroneous things about her faith. She would never speak up because she was afraid of the consequences, which, as you can see, can be dire. She, however, said, would you like to meet my priest? I said, I would like to meet your priest. So she brought me to a cathedral. She brought me to a cathedral, St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is a very big diocese in Karachi. A number of diplomats worship there. On the way, we saw her hospital. The first thing I saw in her hospital was a little notice board. Many of the nurses, one of the matrons in the hospital, are Christians, and they had a little sign saying, God bless you, which I saw as a very Christian expression. I spoke to many Christian colleagues. I did not show their faces at their request. This woman I'm speaking to is a matron. That means she's in charge of many schedules for many different nurses. And she explained to me how important it was to make sure nobody could ever accuse her of favoring Christians on the rotation. So often they did not have the most favorable schedules, so that they could not be criticized for her giving preference to Christian nurses on her schedule over Muslim nurses. Later on, as I was leaving the building, she came to tell me that she was seeking political asylum in the United States. This is her ordinary, everyday day. Inside her shirt, I could see that she was wearing a necklace, and she had religious iconography hidden inside her clothes, rather like in Saudi Arabia, except now we're in a Muslim democracy where there have been Christian ministers, yet she did not feel safe to demonstrate it. We went to her cathedral, which, as you can see, is a magnificent building. When you go to the gate, there are some ordinary Pakistani Christians who just managed the gate. They didn't prevent me, didn't ask me who I was, welcomed me to see it, and it's in fairly immaculate condition from the outside. The father allowed me to see some of his holy books, which were translated in Hebrew and Greek and I think English, but I'm told there is Hebrew in part of his texts, very carefully looked after. These books are published in Pakistan. And this is in Urdu. This is Muqaddas, which means Genesis. I can certainly read that. The book of Genesis, which he showed me, he was keeping. All with beautiful pride. As you can see, he took me to the back of the church, wherever the priest keeps his vestments and things for different services. Very humble surroundings, wooden shelves covered in paper with a little iron that his assistant would iron the clothing with great pride. This was the Christian congregation. Maybe we can turn the lights down a little bit, please, because then the pictures are easy to see. That's fine, no problem. So I haven't published any of these pictures because I don't know that it would be very helpful, but you can certainly see them. And we're in the St. Patrick's Cathedral. In the center is Father Edward Joseph, and I found him a very compelling figure. He took me later on to the top of the building, where you can see there are some damaged stained glass windows, actually many windows, because in the early 1990s, the mosque was targeted to an attack by a lone Muslim Pakistani. He wanted to cause maximum damage while the congregation was in place. Fortunately, no lives were lost, but the many windows remain destroyed, and the congregation is too poor to replace the windows. As I talked to him, this time last year, so Joseph Colony hadn't happened, but there had been a very important assassination that had happened recently for someone asking for repeal of the blasphemy laws. And I asked him, what is it like for you to be a priest to Christians in such a hostile environment? How do you give your followers confidence, and how do you encourage them to remain engaged in their faith and not just leave the faith? And he said to me, Dr. Ahmed, just as Jesus had his cross to bear, so too do we. And he said it with great, that's all he said to me, which I felt was a very Christian interpretation of intolerable circumstances. Now, what are these blasphemy laws? And I'll stop at any time, because we can go on for a long, you'll tell me when it's too long, and we can stop at any point. The blasphemy laws are exactly why religious persecution is so brilliantly crafted in Pakistan and so embedded in the Pakistani constitution. The reason this is of international importance is that Pakistan has a leading position in the Organization for the Islamic Cooperation, or the OIC, and is spearheading global efforts to make blasphemy laws universal. There have been over 22 resolutions passed to this effect. So I find this very troublesome. The purported point of the blasphemy laws is that they are to protect Islam from defamation. Most sensible Muslims will realize a monotheism that's lasted a millennium and a half is not under threat by any individual saying offensive things, or even desecrating a book, or challenging an idea or refuting its existence, because these beliefs are very established. So secure, intelligent Muslims don't really see a place for blasphemy to be prosecuted. In fact, many Muslims, and I'm one of them, feel that blasphemy, the crime of blasphemy, is something between man and his maker. It's not something to be judged in this world. If there is an answer for it, you will give an answer for it in the afterlife. Pakistan has different ideas. Now, in the beginning, I showed you the family who was missing their mother holding the photograph. This is their mother, Asiya Bibi. She's not a Muslim woman, she's a Christian woman, but she's veiling out of modesty because she's in front of the cameras. And when I visited in Pakistan, I found it very difficult to distinguish between Christians and Muslims because of their attire. It's something actually I'm finding also difficult in Israel, because everybody is very homogenous in many ways. She's sitting next to a fairly distinguished man who is who at the time was the governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer. Now, Salman Taseer was a newspaper magnate, a publishing magnate, a multi-millionaire. He is originally of, I think, some Persian descent, but he's a Muslim, and he felt the blasphemy laws were vehemently unfair. This Christian woman, Asiya Bibi, was falsely accused of blasphemy, really because some fellow women didn't like her. And one of the major motives for accusing individuals of blasphemy in Pakistan is personal vendetta, property conflicts, or other disagreements between individuals. It's rarely established on evidence, it's almost always on hearsay, and it's usually based out of personal venom. It's not even really the desecration of a religion, if that's what you think needs to be punished in this world. So he made this he made a leading public effort to say this is grossly unfair, and these laws are archaic. These laws, which were passed in 1984, quite recently, are grossly archaic and should be repealed and should be revised. And this is an injustice against this poor woman who has left 3 children. And the consequences for that were in his town of Lahore, which is where I was at the Polo Club. He was dining at one of his favorite restaurants at lunchtime, and he was executed by a member of his own security detail in broad daylight with a machine gun. Nobody stopped him. He was executed because he was deemed earlier by a Muslim cleric to be wajib al-qatl, which means eligible for murder, because of his views criticizing the blasphemy laws. So actually, I've given this kind of discussion many times, but this is the first time I've been speaking about it in the Middle East, and this is probably the only place in the Middle East we can have this discussion, and I can still go home. He's going here. He's mortally wounded in this. He's mortally wounded or close to death in this ambulance. Post-mortem reports reported by the Pakistani press showed that there were additional bullets found in his body that did not come from the murderer's weapon. So there is some concern that inside the ambulance, in case he wasn't immediately killed, he was finished off. Now, that people look distressed there. They're going there in ambulance. It was devastating, and it happened about a day or two apart from the attempted assassination of the American Congresswoman Gabrielle Gifford. So the same week in the United States, we were shocked that somebody had attempted to assassinate an American Congresswoman. This man was assassinated for defending a Christian woman. And there was a funeral. However, this is the outcome of the murderer. So the murderer, look at the image. I really want you to look at the image. It's a press image. And he has a defiant chin, which is body language for I did something really good. This is a natural body language. He's being assailed by the press rather like a rock star. If you look at members of individuals, including, I think there are policemen with hats on or soldiers, most people are smiling. When he was arraigned, I can't remember which city, it may have been Lahore, I'm not sure. At his arraignment, he was applauded by lawmakers, and he was garlanded in roses, and the lawmakers were standing on rose petals. These are the legislators of Pakistan, the Muslim democracy. Do you understand how entrenched it is? So when I'm telling you about Saudi Arabia and I feel afraid that my nurse is showing her cross, or I'm afraid that I told my friend I'll meet you after your service at the embassy, that's one element. But when this is publicly acceptable, there is no space for religious freedom. This is also an important image, and anyone who criticizes many critics of Israel, one thing that I find it very difficult to criticize Israel for is any infringement on religious freedom. So one of the things that Israel is known for is to be a place which has been a place to worship and live for the Ahmadi Muslim community. So this is somebody's passport. It's not my passport. It's somebody's passport who is Pakistani. Pakistan is the only country in the world. There are about 57 Muslim majority countries currently. It is the only country in the world that has redefined what it means to be Muslim. So if anyone wants to become Muslim or is Muslim, I had to prove that I was a Muslim when I went to Al-Aqsa on Monday. It's a very simple task. You just have to say what is called the Shahada, which you know, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. There's one God, Muhammad is his prophet. This is acceptable through history, and it is acceptable globally. In Pakistan, this is not sufficient. In Pakistan, you need to renounce that not only do you believe in one God and you believe Muhammad is his prophet, but you also renounce the founder of the Ahmadi movement. You renounce him by name and you sign a document. If you do not renounce, then you do not get a passport and you do not get to vote. You have to disclose your religion in order to vote in an election. So they've just been celebrating, particularly in the New York Times and other publications, the peaceful transfer of democracy in Pakistan for the first time in its 65 years history or 66 years history. And this has been a great procedure of self-congratulation, largely in opinion pieces and on what I regard to be uninformed media commentary. There are 211 or 212 parliamentary seats in Pakistan for 187 million individuals. Of them, only 10 are open to minority votes. So there's no political advantage to campaigning for the rights of minorities, even if you're the biggest minority, which is Shia. 16 to 18% of Pakistan is a Shia Muslim. The next majority is probably Christian, is 3 to 5%. Then you have Ahmadis, there may be Baha'is, animists, others. That's the only, you're getting less than 10%, you're getting less than 5% of parliamentary seats available for millions of people. These people are disenfranchised legally. They're disenfranchised legally because they do not meet the state mandate of whatever the official religion is. That has been changed constitutionally through complicated procedures that appear democratic but are not. They're almost all amendments of the law by appointed committees that were originally appointed by Ziaul Haq, who was the leader of Pakistan, but then needed to Islamicize the country to gain a power base. So this is why it's accepted and legally facilitated to persecute minorities. In fact, 2 of the blasphemy laws in Pakistan target specific Ahmadis. If you're an Ahmadi Muslim in Pakistan and you dare to greet someone with salams, or you dare to give somebody a book about Islam, you are subject to blasphemy with terrible punishments. The punishments are capital crimes. At the best possibility, you may get life imprisonment. The worst possibility is capital punishment. And the vast majority of punishments for blasphemy laws have fallen on Ahmadis and Christians. The vast majority, some Muslim minorities, Ahmadis and Christians. While nobody has been executed by the state for blasphemy, many individuals have been imprisoned and have either perished in custody from torture, or they have been released to be lynched by a mob. You saw the kind of mob that was involved in the Joseph colony. Maybe we'll get to the last couple of things, because I think you want to make remarks and eventually somebody wants a solution to this, and I think I have somewhat of a solution. I want you to look at these graves. You may remember in 2010, in the spring of 2010, there was a world outcry at a flotilla incident engaging Turkey with Israeli forces, and some individuals lost their lives. I don't know if it was on both sides or just on the Turkish side. On the Turkish, 9 lives were lost. 9 lives were lost. There was a global outcry. There was global vilification, and there was a terrible political crisis as a result. In about the same week, there was a massacre. The massacre occurred in Pakistan. The massacre occurred at the hands of, I will call them Muslim extremists. And it occurred in an Ahmadi mosque, actually in 2 locations in suburban Lahore, simultaneously. I think in total there were 6 gunmen. Over 83 lives were lost. People, when they worship in a mosque, they usually are in rows, and the front rows will be occupied by the elderly or the most senior or the most important. They were all executed. The doors were locked. People were died under gunfire. And this was all on live television. There was no global outcry. They were executed really because they were minority Muslims. There was no, these are their graves, temporary graves. You can read people's names on there, and the Ahmadis are mourning them. But nowhere in the Muslim world was there any protest to the death of these minorities. There's never an investigation. Nobody was ever convicted, even though it was a very widely viewed event. Here's another example of religious persecution in Pakistan. These are headstones of graves. They're headstones of Ahmadi mosques, Ahmadi Muslims in graves. And I don't think I can show you a good picture, but one of the reasons that these graves were desecrated is the Muslims that were buried there, the Ahmadi Muslims, I recognize them to be Muslims like Shia or Sunni or Sufi or anything. I think they're Muslim. They had buried on their headstones their names with their dates of birth and death, and usually some sort of Muslim verse. Because they were deemed non-Muslim by the state, Muslims came along and eradicated what was on their gravestones, because it was deemed blasphemous for these non-Muslims to have Muslim verses on their gravestones. Ahmadi Muslims have even been exhumed from cemeteries for their views. This is, to me, the very enormous threat to the persecution of Christians, of Muslims, of remnants of Jewish communities that we perhaps don't even know about, much more than anything I think we see in the Middle East. The reason it's much more is it's a highly articulate, well-spoken, established, politically recognized, legitimate democracy. It's a democracy which, while it's decrying, let's say, actions of this state here in Israel, or actions in Afghanistan, or in American engagements, it is actively persecuting minorities. And it does so while it sits on human rights committees in New York, where I live, and it has not been held to task. Part of the solution is going to be to hold countries like Pakistan to task. Instead, a blind eye is turned. They receive enormous US aid because at the moment they are necessary for certain reasons, and none of this is exposed or even discussed. Even in the recent events of a Pakistani election on May 11th, these factions are not discussed. There is nobody speaking for them or speaking about them. I have many other things I could say, but I'm going to stop here because I know Michael would like to say something, Dr. Widlanski and Dr. Schneider. I want you to know one other thing is that I'm speaking to you as an individual. I don't represent any of the universities with whom I'm academically affiliated. These are based on my eyewitness experiences, but there's nothing I've said tonight that I haven't published in the press already. So there's nothing that I don't stand by. And if it was somewhat disparate, it's because I see this problem with a rather global view than something that is only confined to this region or even to the regional conflict. I was just learning about Bethlehem and Christians today. So I'm going to give up the podium and look forward to Dr. Widlanski's remarks.